So how do you find your subtype? With 1 in 27, it's not necessarily the easiest thing to do. I get it. And I certainly went through a bit of a drama with it, both finding my type and then finding my subtype. So I want to share some of those tips to help you in your journey. Hi, I'm Samantha Kai, Enneagram coach certified by the Chestnut Pies Enneagram Academy. And if you are keen to find your subtype, I have created a subtype starter kit. You should find a link in the description. That includes more tips and strategies and help and other things in order to help you do that. So you want to find your subtype, but the thought of sifting through 27 subtypes is a little overwhelming. Absolutely. And the challenge is, though, there's so much lookalike types that there can be quite a lot of mistyping within the subtype. So how do you go about it? So I think firstly, you start with the 1 of 9, but you hold the 1 of 9 loosely. So how it worked for me is when I first tested with the Enneagram, I tested as a 5, and that just didn't sound like me. And I completely set it aside. And I had a copy of Helen Palmer's book at the time, and I just found that really confusing. So again, I set the whole thing aside. And honestly, I wish I hadn't, but that's what happens when we take a test or the material's confusing. It's just not accessible, which is both understandable and entirely frustrating. So a few years later, I met an Enneagram coach, an Integrative 9 coach, and she gave me a link to do the Integrative 9 test. And the day before I was due to meet her to read my results, because I didn't get them automatically, I decided I have to know what my type is before we meet. And so I pulled out Beatrice Chestnut's 9 Types of Leadership, which is the main Enneagram book I had at the time, and started reading through it. And I quickly read through the whole thing super fast, as only a 7 could do. And got to the end and thought, oh, well, none of these were me. Thankfully, I thought, how about we read a little more of each chapter, a little slower, and see what emerges. So slowly but surely, I eliminated the types and slowed down and read things. And funnily enough, once I actually got into the detail of this 7 description, it really stood out to me. I was like, yes, I'm a 7. And so the next day, I go and get my test results, and I'm a 7. But the subtype that the Integrative 9 has given me is a sexual 7. I think the Integrative 9 is a great test that does do subtypes. It's highly reliable. But any test can give you a false reading because it's based on your perception of self. And I remember distinctly being in the test and answering the questions about subtype. And I agonized over the question. And I answered for the sexual 7, not knowing what any of it meant at the time, because I truly saw myself as this entertaining, enlightening, joie de vivre, person. And that's not who I actually was, but it's who I ideally wanted to be. I saw myself as living in a music video, singing and dancing down the street with lights and unicorns and sound and action. And it was a place I could sort of disappear to quite easily. And I assumed that meant that was who I was. And so we sat with that for a while and I didn't do anything else with it until a few years later when I found myself in Beatrice Chestnut and Narania Pire's coaching class of how to use the Enneagram in coaching. And I was in a group of 7s, as you're allocated to do, and there was a mix of all of us, all different subtypes. And the sexual 7s looked at me and said, we're not sure that you're actually a sexual 7. You might be a self-pres. And I was like, oh, okay. I'm not sure I want to be a self-pres, but sure, sure. And then as part of the program, you work with a coach and we discuss that. And so as part of that ongoing discovery, I got the complete Enneagram. And I took the 3 sections, the 3 subtype descriptions in the 7 chapter, and I underlined everything from those 3 subtypes that sounded like me. And then I counted up the lines and I ranked them. I was trying to be as objective and logical about it as possible. And sure enough, it was self-pres had the most, then sexual, and then social had the least. And it was that moment when I then looked over the self-pres description and had that real sinking feeling of, oh, this is me. I absolutely had to be cunning and resourceful in childhood. And those are moments I both enjoyed and appreciating having those skills to rely on. And yes, I absolutely pull groups of people together to help meet my needs, even though I didn't understand how that was helping me feel safe at the time. And so when I found my subtype, it was both a relief and a disappointment. And I don't think that's an uncommon experience because it can be really hard to see that we thought was us isn't fully us, that part of it is a coping strategy, an adaptation to the loss of being able to express our true thoughts and feelings in childhood. So, all of that's to say, it can take time to find your subtype. Here's what I recommend. First, get to know the 9 types and really discover which one might be you. And I do recommend the 9 types of leadership. I found those descriptions really accessible, but you might also like the Enneagram Guide to Waking Up, also really accessible and useful. And it's far more focused on the 9 types than it is on the subtypes. And so once you've got a sense of what your top 2 to 3 types might be, then it's time to have a look at subtypes. And again, you can use particular books to help you do that. But there's also podcasts with interviews of each type and panel interviews with people of each subtype. So I want you to really narrow it down to really 1 to 2 subtypes that you think are most like you. Then start doing that research work. Read the descriptions in Beatrice Chestnut's The Complete Enneagram, the descriptions in Shock Point by Chad Prevost. Listen to a few podcasts. And if you really want to dive into the subtypes, CP Enneagram Academy has a subtype panel interview that's really interesting. They interview 6 people, 2 of each subtype. I found it really useful for understanding some of the nuances. And you can do what I did. You can think about ranking each of the subtype descriptions within that type. But a lot of it is just trying it on and seeing which one matches most closely to you. Now, if you're stuck between 2 different types, let's say between Self-Pres 1 and Self-Pres 6, and you're really not sure, that can be when it's helpful to start talk to someone who knows you really well, or talk to someone like me, an Enneagram coach who's trained in subtype interviews or trained in subtypes, because they might often be able to ask questions or things that you hadn't thought of. Or this is a great point to consider taking a test, and possibly more than one test. I realize I'm encouraging you to spend lots of money on books and tests, but sometimes it takes that kind of effort to really figure out what your subtype is. So there are 2 tests that do subtypes well, as far as I'm currently aware, and that is the Integrative 9 and the CP Enneagram Compass. The reports are really different, but really at this point, you're just using it to help you validate or provide more information about your research so far. And I get it. What I've just suggested is a lot of work, but if you are going to use the Enneagram as your model for development, it does help to know you're using the right type, particularly subtype. Now, there is a lot of Enneagram work you can do that knowing a precise type isn't necessary. But when you're really ready to focus on it, using your subtype provides much more precision and impact, which means you'll get more bang for your buck, more return on how much energy and effort you're putting in, because inner work isn't easy. And I really prefer it if people are getting as much out of it as they're putting in, and subtype provides that. So those are a few suggestions on how to find your subtype. The podcast to have a look at are Enneagram 2.0 and The Art of Growth. They do a lot of the subtype panels, which can be really informative. Well, I hope that helps you find your subtype. All right,